Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our final presentation of Day 2 of the Body-Worn Camera PIP annual meeting. My name is Allie Land, and I'm the Deputy Project Manager working with BJA's Body-Worn Camera Training and Technical Assistance Program. As a reminder, points of view or opinions expressed herein do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. And now I will pass it off to BWC TTA Lead and Police Practices Consultant, Scott Hogue, a Public Safety Insight, and BWC TTA Lead and President of Principus Group, Dan Zender, to begin the session, understanding the benefits of compliance checks and audits. Scott and Dan.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak to everyone today. Dan and I were just talking offline earlier today, and he and I have been having this discussion about the importance of compliance checks and audits and the difference between the terminology for a number of years. Real quickly, as we get started here, just to introduce myself, again, Scott Hogue. I spent 32 years in law enforcement, retired as the chief of police of a mid-sized agency here. We used body-worn cameras since 2008. And so we've got a lot of experience on the benefits of audits and compliance. The other thing that I do a lot of that I think will be relevant to today's discussion is community engagement, speaking, and also use of force and officer safety. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the benefits that a good compliance program can provide you when it comes to officer safety, when it comes to use of force. And so we'll talk more about that. I'm going to pause real quick and let Dan do a quick introduction of himself before we go on to the next slide.
Good afternoon, everyone. Dan Zender, a retired captain from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department and a member of the Body Camera Training and Technical Assistance Team since its inception in 2015. I was involved in the management of the body camera program for Las Vegas at its inception, essentially 2014 to 2016, early 2017, and then started my own consulting and training company back in 2015 to help agencies get their, figure their way out through this maze of things that we've been talking about over the last 2 days.
So what we want to, obviously, these are the objectives for today, and I just want to go through these real quickly. And again, we would encourage questions. If there are questions that you have, please put them in the chat box. We'll either get to those now or we can get back to you a little bit later. Today, we're going to talk about two different terms. We're going to talk about compliance and we're going to talk about auditing of your BWC program. And these words, although similar, are really different. And I think it's really important if you walk away from today's session of understanding the difference between the two, as well as the importance of having both of them in place. I talk with agencies all the time that I work with, and they say, yeah, we do this. And then when you really dig down into it, they really do one or the other or neither. So we're going to talk about why it's important, some of the components that are required in doing it, who should be doing the checking. For a compliance program, maybe the checking should be done by, an internal of folks. And then for the audit, maybe you have external people come in, and we'll talk quite a bit about that during our time with you today. And then what should you be looking for? What do you want whoever's doing that compliance check and that audit check? What do you want them looking for? What's going to be in the report that you expect? And then an important piece of it is, what do we do with it when it's found? In a compliance check, if you have a supervisor that is doing video reviews and they find something that's either very positive or something that's very negative, so an area that needs to be focused on, maybe in the training arena, what do they do with that information? And we want to make sure that when you have these programs, a compliance or an audit program, that you do have positive outcomes. You shouldn't be just doing them to do them. There should be some kind of benefit that comes out the other side.
So what's in the name? We titled this slide, and this came from a discussion that we had here in the TTA a couple of years ago, trying to come up with some standardized language when talking about these processes. And essentially, we couldn't come to an agreement. You'll hear these terms: compliance, performance monitoring, audits, used interchangeably, and they're really, anybody that has a financial background will understand what an audit is and in the difference in the body camera world, which we'll talk about towards the end of the presentation here. But so you hear all these terms thrown out, and so what's the name? Well, whatever name you want to give it, it's not important what you call it. it's what it does. So the importance that we try to make sure agencies understand is that whatever it is you call it, please define that terminology. If you call it performance monitoring or compliance or audits, tell people what that is, especially people external to your agency that are looking in. But they're two separate processes, and I think that'll be clear to you by the time we get to the end of our session. So as I said, could be monitoring, compliance checks. It should be done by both a supervisor and at the agency level. And unfortunately, what we see a lot of is it's done, most agencies have something in their policy. It says a supervisor will check videos, X amount of videos, X amount of times a month, then that's it. And we're advocating that you should consider not just a supervisory check, but to also look at it at the agency level. And both levels of this are ensuring the policies and procedures are being followed. And the last piece of this, the audit, is going to say, are we doing what we said we were going to do? Can we prove that by the audit process?
Okay, so we've got a poll question here. Does your agency conduct compliance checks? So you should have had something pop up on your screen there. If you could take a minute and just complete that.
And please understand that compliance is, again, whatever it is you call it, audits, performance monitoring. Are you doing something like that?
Okay, so Dan talked about the compliance side of it. For the audit side of it, basically what you're wanting to do is you're wanting to look at your compliance program, the process and documentation. You want to make sure that the program that you have in place to verify that what you said you would do is happening is double checked. I know when in our organization, we had a program where randomly our supervisors had to check a video and make sure that it was where we needed it to be. And at the end of that, they were required to complete, a document or a small short report. And we found out that, during an audit that wasn't happening. And so if you say you're going to do compliance, you say you're going to do weekly checks, and then you don't do something, it doesn't look good on your organization, especially if something goes really bad. We all have a tremendous amount of data coming into our organization. And it's just a matter of a time before a plaintiff's attorney walks in and wants to take a look at that video and try to show that you have a pattern in practice of not doing what you should be doing. I'll pause real quick. Here's our poll here. It looks like 89% conduct compliance checks with 11% that don't. That's outstanding. Every year that we do this presentation, those numbers continue to go up. And I am so pleased to see that organizations are putting some kind of a compliance program in work. So back to the audits, we want to make sure that our program's working like we think it is, and written documentation is extremely important. That audit that's done, we recommend on an annual basis, should have some kind of a report that's completed at the end of it to be able to show that you're auditing your program. Okay, another poll question. So different than compliance, how many agencies are conducting an audit of their program? Okay, we got another poll here. Dan, I'll let you take this one.
So as you define compliance and auditing processes and how you're currently doing, this poll question goes to, are you satisfied with what that's doing for your agency? So the results for the audits is 68% do have audits, and we'll talk about more about those at the back end of this. And let's see, 33% do not do audits. And are you confident or satisfied? Do we have the results on that one? So 68% of the agencies are happy with what they're doing from the audit standpoint. So again, two things I would ask you to keep in mind is by the end of this presentation, if we were to ask you that question again, would your answer change based on some of the information and recommendations that we're making? Again, understanding these terminologies are different and the size of your agency, there's a lot of factors that go into these compliance and auditing processes that you have inside your agency. So good to see, though, a majority of you are satisfied with it. So over the last couple of days, we've heard a lot of discussion about an excellent discussion, by the way, especially this morning on technology and its ability to, its potential, I would say, to support the processes that Scott and I are going to talk about, especially what we're terming the compliance piece of this. There's a lot in this world of machine learning, artificial intelligence, whatever, AI, however you want to term it and use it. There's a lot of potential coming down the road, but there are issues with that. And one of them is it's not, as I think some of our presenters spoke about earlier, it's not ready for prime time, a lot of it yet. And its ability to look at everything that the agency may want to look at is not really there yet. We know that it's providing some excellent potential to looking at things at use of force and interaction between officers and the public, but there's a cost issue with this, especially on the front end. There's going to be a cost issue, and is it really something that's going to be practical for smaller agencies, especially? Do you need it? Do you have the resources? Do you have the resources in your agency to even follow up with what could potentially be a tsunami of more data and stuff that your agency has to possibly react to? And it's just the technology's capacity to meet some of the needs of agencies, at least in the short term, is questionable. And so the point of this presentation is to give you some things to think about when it comes to doing this manually before that technology gets to the point where it is doing what we hope that it will do. And how do you do that, addressing some of the things that were talked about earlier about human review of it and biases and the technical expertise of the people looking at it and determining whether or not something that's in that video is right or wrong in accordance with the agency's training and policies and procedures. So there's a lot to unpack there. We're very hopeful about that piece of it, that there will be technology will come down the road, but it's not here yet. And so we're offering some things for you to think about in the meantime. So compliance and simply is looking at all these things, right? This graphic is here just to show you that it's an illustration of those things that we believe you should be looking at across your agency. And whether you're looking at through the vehicle, a body camera, or some other process that you have inherent in your agencies, I'm sure that a lot of you do look at these things without doing it through the lens of a body camera. But body cameras give us an ability to look at things sometimes that we don't normally have. And so you're looking at all these things. Are your officers following the laws? Are the rules and regulations and policies of the agency being followed? And not just body camera policies, but all policies. So I like to say this, one of the reasons a body camera or a compliance program is so important is because we own everything on every one of those videos that your agency records, whether you look at it or not. And we've come a long way from the early days of body cameras. If somebody did something, external entities outside of the agency would look at that video when it was finally made available to them and comment on it. Now, today, if you have a controversial incident in your agency, a lot of times the media, for example, knows they can't get that video because it's related to an ongoing investigation, perhaps, especially if there's wrongdoing on the part of the officer, or the agency has a pretty good idea that there was some significant wrongdoing by the officer. We had a very famous case in Las Vegas where an officer used excessive force, and obviously we fired him. He was prosecuted both locally and federally. And that video wasn't releasable. Back in those days, though, nobody knew what to do if they couldn't get their hands on it. Nowadays, they're more savvy. They'll put in a public records request for video by that officer unrelated to the event. And God forbid, if the behavior that was shown in the event in question, there were precursor events, these things will come back to haunt the agency. And so you have to always be looking at, and I think that's one of the advantages of the potential advantages of this technology that was talked about this morning, is to be able to get to this stuff before it becomes a problem and then fix it.
When we talk about continuing why a compliance program is important, I think this is a really important slide, and I just want to spend a couple of moments on it. As Dan says, we own it. We've recorded this. We have gigabytes or terabytes or petabytes of this information coming into our organization on a daily basis, and we own it. And you should be looking, at this from a compliance standpoint, because if you don't, like I mentioned just a few moments ago, a plaintiff's attorney will come in at some point in time and say, I want to see the last 6 months of Officer XYZ's videos, and they will be able to show a pattern in practice that the agency could have or should have prevented this, or that they should have known about it. And we know that culture eats policy for lunch. And if you have a culture in your organization that your officers are doing something a certain way, you want to know about that. And you have the information right at your fingertips to be able to know what the pattern and practice of your organization is. You want to ensure that evidence is being captured properly, making sure that the cameras are turned on when appropriate, that the cameras are uploaded, they're tagged properly. Third bullet point there is a really important one to me: protecting your officers. So many times we put the cameras on the officers and they go out, and so it's going to record what they're doing and it's going to protect them. But we don't think about the benefits of a compliance review, of looking for things that can protect the officers from an officer safety standpoint. We know across this country that officers are injured or killed in preventable incidents. I would argue that nearly half of the officers that have been killed, I think we've had 82 that have died in the line of duty so far this year, according to ODMP. About half of those are preventable. Their officers are being injured or killed in training. They're being injured and killed in driving. They're doing things that they shouldn't be doing. And if an agency can find those videos, they can potentially correct an action before it happens. And again, I'm not encouraging anyone to review videos to get officers in trouble or to make it a difficult place to work. But there are things that we can do in reviewing these videos to improve officer safety and protect our officers. Obviously, we protect the agency, because if we can see something coming down the pike, we can see that event that we should have known about, we can catch that early on. The validation of your commitment to the community. I think that videos play a very crucial role in community engagement. We struggle with that right now in law enforcement. All of us know that there's a struggle with, community engagement. And, I'm not aware of any professional sports team who doesn't use video to improve their process, and we should be looking at it the same way. We have this video. Are we reviewing it and looking at ways that we can improve the service that we're providing to the community? And then it enhances transparency and accountability. I would encourage you to not be thinking about looking for negative things on these videos, but looking for the positive things that your officers are doing out there each and every day. Stopping by the lemonade stand and visiting with the young people, mowing the yard of the person that couldn't do it. We had officers that would shovel driveways. We had officers that would do all kinds of outstanding things that we could take and, we could spotlight. Laura McElroy, some of you may know her. She's nationally recognized crisis communications. She said something in New Orleans in 2017 that really stuck with me. It's like, if you want to be liked, be likable. And you really have to get your message out there that you're doing a good job, and that people can see that. It helps manage performance, and then it validates and supports training. Again, we just published an article on this recently about agencies that are using body-worn camera video for training. So important to use this video, review it, and figure out where you have training deficiencies, or spotlight where your training is working. I always say what gets recognized gets repeated. So if you're seeing positive things in these compliance checks, make sure that you're recognizing your team and validating what they're doing.
One of the big ones is your organizational culture is being captured. And I've always said, the minute you put that body camera on one of your officers and send him or her out to do their jobs, everything that your agency stands for culturally is being recorded, and we tend to forget about that until it's too late. And earlier when we showed that slide, we own it slide, I know some of you out there probably going, well, there's no way I can be responsible, depending on the size of your agency, to look at all that video. Yeah, you're correct. Nobody expects the LAPDs and the NYPDs to look at every single video. However, it doesn't absolve you from the expectation the public has that there's a process in place, that somebody's looking at some level and trying to do something with what the body cameras are capturing. And so not doing it is not doing one of the processes, either an automated process in the future, or what we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. Not doing it isn't acceptable. So that small minority of you that answered one of the first poll questions that you don't have a program in place, I know that's part of the structuring and the development of your program. It's something that you should consider giving priority to.
Okay. Program scope, what are you attempting to learn? And I just asked this as a rhetorical question to you folks that are on here that are leaders in your organization. Is your agency operating as you think it is? I just pause there for a minute and you think about that. I know that when we first had our body-worn camera program implemented, I thought everything was going great until all of a sudden I started to, about 3 times a week, I would just sit down and just randomly pick a video and just spend about 10 or 15 minutes watching that video. And it was a real eye-opener for me to learn that things weren't going how I thought they should be, or how we had proposed that they should be. And so it enabled us, by watching those videos, to be able to make some rudder taps on the organization to make sure that you're headed in the direction that you want to be headed. Are you following the policies and procedures, especially of your BWC program? Are you activating the camera when you should? Is it being turned off when it shouldn't be? Is it being tagged? Tagging is an important part of a BWC program. And then is our organizational cultural and core values reflected in what you see? When you look at these videos, is this what you want your organization to look like? And I hope it is. I hope when you watch these videos, it's a proud moment and everything's going like it should be. But I would just encourage you to not have your head stuck in the sand and take a look at these videos. Even if you're, the chief or a deputy chief, spend some time to just take a quick look every once in a while and make sure that everything's going like it should be. Do you have training gaps? Are you seeing training issues? Are there areas that we can improve? We're not using Miranda correctly? Are our Terry stops not where they need to be? Are we using force where we shouldn't use force? Those are some things that you should be looking at and can catch early on. I really believe, and I don't want to get into any of the details, I do a lot of expert witness work in the use of force area. And as I review body-worn camera videos, many times I am absolutely shocked at the way that officers have interacted with people, some of the force that they've used. And it just makes me wonder if some of these things that we've seen on a national level that have drawn criticism to us in law enforcement, if those couldn't have been prevented. Could we have saved an officer jail time or losing their job as a leader by taking the time to do compliance checks and make sure that they're following the policies and procedures, and when they're not, have that hand on the shoulder discussion to say, hey, I've watched this video, here's some things that I think you could improve in. And then can you identify risk to the agency, looking for that gray rhino event, looking for that multi-thousand-pound animal that's rushing at you that you knew or should have known is going to crush you? Can you prevent that from happening? Okay, program components. Policy is obviously the foundation. I am a firm believer that policy is the most important thing, that you have this in writing, that you document it. Who is going to look at these videos? The supervisors. What are they looking at? That should be outlined, and then documenting it at the end of it. Again, it doesn't need to be a long, lengthy report and a compliance check. It can be just real simple that it was reviewed and what the supervisor saw. And then having a clear process in place for what do we do to follow up on this information once it's found.
So we have another poll question for you. At what level in your agency does your compliance program take place? And this is going to lead us segue into the next section of the presentation. So we ask you to consider two levels, supervisory and agency level. And frequently we see a lot of the supervisory piece. As I mentioned earlier, you see something in policy that talks about supervisors looking at videos. Unfortunately, we also see a lot of agencies don't do some sort of agency process. And so they kind of abdicate the responsibility for all those things that Scott just talked about to first line supervisors. As that last bullet comments, I like to say sergeants look for things that sergeants have always looked at, and that is sergeant stuff. You know, are my officers, my deputies, my troopers, are they doing what they should be doing? The first line supervisor isn't necessarily looking at things that the chief or the sheriff would be looking at, or executive team. You know, the supervisor is not really going to be looking for constitutional policing issues or culture of the agency, concerns the agency may have. And, you know, the bigger the agency, the bigger the challenges becomes. Do you have supervisors looking at video? If you've got 50 supervisors, you're going to get 50 different reviews of a piece of video. The tenured 20-year sergeant versus the 2-month sergeant. So there's a lot of challenges, but all these things on the slide are things that supervisors are looking for. But they're looking at it at the supervisory level, not necessarily at the agency level. Okay, here's the results. So supervisor level only 46% or 48%. Agency level only 7%. And I suspect those agency level only are generally the smaller agencies. And I should mention, because it just, you know, this reminded me that the smaller your agency is, the more the expectation will be that this process is locked in. You know, if you're the LAs and the Philadelphias and Chicagos of the world, again, nobody expects you to look at every video. But if you've got 12 or 15 officers, somebody's, you know, and something bad happens, they're going to expect that your agency was looking at the vast majority of those videos. So you see this language, I kind of alluded to it earlier. You know, supervisors look at X amount of videos, X amount of time in length, X amount of times a month. And that should be in your policy and clearly outlined. And what the last two bullets should be things that, you know, what if you're looking at other than those things that were on the previous slide, what is it that the agency is asking supervisors to look for? Perhaps you've had a problem in your agency with the officer excessive driving speeds, for example. And so now we want supervisors to look for that when they're doing their monthly reviews. That has to come down through the agency. It's also important that you have some mechanism in place that documents the fact that these supervisory reviews are taking place and that they're being, that documentation is being forwarded to a repository at the appropriate level inside the agency. And as I always like to say, you know, just because you say you do this in your policy, it doesn't guarantee policy compliance. At the agency level, the agency is concerned about kind of the bigger picture, you know, activation and deactivation policy compliance. More importantly, other than just, as I mentioned earlier, more than just the body camera activation, deactivation, we're looking at all those things that Scott talked about, application of the law. You know, are we doing Terry stops? Are our use of force appropriate? You know, you're looking at video content for review and analysis. And this is where we see great promise with technology coming down the road. As I mentioned, you know, your organizational culture and operational effectiveness. The big area that it's outside of the scope of this presentation, but how can we leverage what the agency sees and what the supervisors see to avoid risk in the future? And that's a growing area of interest. How do we leverage this video for risk avoidance, mitigation, or elimination? So the agency level review it has to be done. Again, you tailor this, it's a matter of scale and scope of your organization. If you're a large agency, maybe you can put 15 or 20 people doing this task. Most agencies, mid-sized agencies, you might only be able to do 2 or 3 in a body camera section, which I know is a best practice that was mentioned earlier. A smaller agency, maybe it's just one person that's looking at it. But you're looking at it from the viewpoint of the agency, not from the viewpoint of the first line supervisor. And that uniform compliance, and understand we're talking kind of a 2 process review. So we're looking both at compliance to the policies, but we're also looking at what's inside the video. So performance, are we performing the way that we think our officers should be performing? And as I said earlier, size of your agency is immaterial. There's an expectation that's done, and the smaller the agency, the more the expectation will be, especially from outside of the agency. The agency review integrates agency sections such as you can bring detectives and professional standards into the process, and most importantly, the chain of command. Right, so it's just not supervisors looking at it. The detective looks at it and sees, for example, poor techniques that are making his investigation more difficult. He's seen on a routine basis. That information should come to that central office or central person and go, hey, we need to fix these things. The same thing from professional standards when they're seeing things that may have resulted in internal affairs complaints that are being investigated. We need to tighten up these particular areas. That can move to that centralized office in the agency, and then that agency office becomes the mechanism that prompts the agency, whether it's command or staff sections of the agency, to react to that and make changes. Most important thing is every time this happens, you need to document. Documentation of this process is very important, because when that thing happens down the road and your agency is taking rocks being thrown at it and saying you're not doing it, you want to be able to provide something that shows that you do have a process in place. Don't confuse the process of compliance with the process of discipline. Scott mentioned this earlier. You've heard it from a number of other speakers. We're not out there looking to get officers in trouble. And this is a thing that it's very important to get across to, especially agencies that have bargaining units. Let them know that this is about making the agency better. Now, obviously, if you see something there in these reviews, whether it's a supervisor looking at it or the agency looking at it, that warrants discipline, then you have to take that step. But that's not the primary intent. And when you roll out a program like this, it's important that the message from the leadership is this process that we're putting in place is about making our agency better and taking care of our officers. You have to balance that with that old statement, policy without policy enforcement isn't really a policy. And it's just a balancing act. So we're not there to get individual officers in trouble, but we are looking for those failures. And if that failure is 5 or 6 officers that did something that warrants not giving them discipline, but fixing a policy thing, get the policy fixed so that performance won't continue.
Okay, before we get into audits, I want to draw everyone's attention to the chat screen. Elliot had just posted, a heartwarming story that went viral, and they found this because of an audit. And it really goes to the point of what I was talking about, of trying to find those moments when your team is doing things that are above and beyond, and you can find them. Your officers are doing these things on a daily and a weekly basis, and getting that out to the public, recognizing the officers for it goes a long way. I've spent recently some time in some very large agencies talking about community engagement, and a lot of times you hear excuses about, well, our prosecutor won't let us release video, the agency doesn't want us to release video. Find a way to be able to talk about this. Even if you say as a supervisor in a social media post, hey, I was reviewing a video today and this is what I saw. Describe it, spell it out that you saw this in a video if you can't release the video, but somehow get that information out there so that the public is aware of it. Okay, so audits. Okay, what is an audit? It's an examination or an inspection of documentation and process. So we've got this compliance program that we want to make sure is going the way that we think it is going. And so we're going to do annually an audit, and we're going to go through and look at all of the documentation, look at the process, look at the policy. We're going to verify that we're doing what we said we would do. And then at the end of it, we're going to have a report that outlines the audit and outlines exactly what was found and any changes that need to happen. Are there areas in our compliance program that we need to be looking at? And this is a perfect opportunity for each agency to be looking at their BWC policy as well. Is the policy that we wrote some time ago, is it still consistent with best practices? are we following all of the components of it? Because we don't want to have a policy out there that is not being followed. I say all the time that the only thing worse than not having body-worn cameras or video is to have them and find out that they weren't recording when they should. Because if you have a body-worn camera and the officer quote quote forgets to turn it on during a critical incident, it really goes against that agency and can really damage your credibility with the courts and the community as well. Okay, why is it important? And we've touched on, a lot of this. We want to avoid the landmines. Gordon Graham talks frequently about predictable is preventable. If we are watching these videos, we can 9 times out of 10 predict what's going to happen. We can find that officer that's out there that's not doing the right thing, and we can prevent him or her from going down that path. So we want to avoid the landmines, and we want to validate things. Like I said, the Laura McElroy statement, if you want to be liked, be likable. Get your folks out there and promote that lemonade stand, the mowing of the grass, the buying of the birthday cake. Find something on a daily, weekly, monthly basis that you guys are doing outstanding and get that out there. Okay, why is it important? We've touched on most of this, but I'll just go through it. We ensure effective operations of our compliance process, validates the compliance with policy, procedure, and laws. Again, those type of things change. Those are not a one and done. When you write your policy or procedure, you need to be looking at those on an annual basis as part of your audit. It instills confidence in the functions. So as an administrator, when you have an audit that's done by a third party, it gives you some kind of confidence that you're doing what you said you would do. And the other piece of it is I really encourage agencies to, announce that you're doing these kind of things so that you enhance that community trust. It's extremely important that we're using the body-worn camera, our compliance program, our audit program to enhance that community trust and doing that due diligence. So then who does them? A lot of agencies will do audits internally. They'll have someone in charge of a certain section that does the audit. That's an acceptable way to do it. I always have felt like an external audit is a good thing to do. In our organization, for our evidence room, for example, we would have an adjacent agency come in and do an audit of our evidence room just to make sure that we were following best practices. And I would encourage agencies to think about that. If you're a sheriff's department, you have a local municipality that can do that for you, and vice versa, you can do it for them. It's really good to have a second set of eyes come in and look and make sure that those audits are being done as they should be. And we recommend, doing them once a year. I think annually is just a good time to do that.
Our next poll question, for those of you that answered that you do audits as you define them at the time, do you do them internally, externally, or both?
Okay, so what are we looking for in the audit? Again, we've talked about some of this stuff, but I just want to go over it again. It really depends on your compliance program, but you should have your compliance program should be well documented in a policy or procedure of how you're going to do it, the way you're going to randomly select videos for review and such. And you want to be looking at to make sure that that's the way that it's actually going. We don't want to have supervisors that are just selectively picking a few officers' videos. We've seen that happen in the past where supervisors are really targeting an employee. We don't want to see that happen. We want some randomness on there. Is that the way that it's being done? We're looking at the processes, the documents. We're looking at recommendations. So the person that does the audit, they would come back and provide recommendations for change. Are there some things that we could be doing better to ensure that our compliance program is what we say it is? Okay, here's our results from our poll. Are your audits done internally or externally? And the vast majority at 83% is internally. So that's good. I would encourage you to think about external audits as an option. And then this slide is really important too, is what do we do when we find something? when we get this audit, we need to make sure that we're reviewing the findings. Someone in the organization at the command staff level is looking at the findings. We don't want to have an audit that's done. There's a plethora of recommendations in there for change, and it just sits in a drawer and doesn't get acted on. We want to determine how to correct those deficiencies. If we have deficiencies, what are they? How do we fix them and get them implemented? And then determining how to maintain or enhance strengths. So if you're doing something well, make sure that that is recognized and that the staff that's doing it knows that they're doing a good job. We want to act, we want to document, and we want to integrate this into our existing risk management process. Your organization is doing audits in a lot of different areas, and this should be no difference, that this should be integrated into those processes, and then provide feedback to the organization. And I think is equally as important, provide feedback to the community. You should be talking to the community about your compliance and your auditing process. There's a lot of opportunity at community meetings to be able to discuss that and tout the great work that you're doing in this area.
So this is our last and final poll question. How often do you do these audits? Do you do them more than annually, yearly, or every couple of years? So the positive outcomes of an effective compliance and audit programs, as Scott alluded to, and I think these are the big takeaways. These two aspects of an overall program helps you find that landmine before it explodes, hopefully. It also allows you to find those hidden gems, those things that you want to, the first one being those things we got to fix before it becomes the bad thing that happens. The other one is enhancing and strengthening those things that we realize are just things that the agency does very well. These two processes validate our agency's policies, our operations, and its organizational culture. And finally, it's validation for everybody, both the agency, its officers, and the community. And, many agencies believe, we say, we're one of the best departments in the country, in the state, in the region, whatever it is. But it's, this validation for the community is probably more important than anything. And as Scott alluded to, getting that information out to the community about what's going on in these programs and how we're doing these things is extremely important. How you package that and get it out to the community. Oh, here are the results. So more than annually, 32%. That's a change from what we've seen in the past. 54% yearly, and 14% of you do it longer than that. So now we have time for questions. I've gotten one that came into me via a message. Can't CALIA serve as an audit?
Well, I think what we're talking about here is a little bit different than CALIA. CALIA has standards that require compliance and audits at certain points of the time. And I would encourage someone to have that in their policy, that this will be, that this program will be audited on a certain time frame. But I guess if you had someone who's in charge of your CALIA certification program, they could conduct the audits as well. But again, I always recommend that you have someone from another agency come out and do that inspection.
And that is the only question I have. Do we have any further questions from anybody in the audience? Well,
okay, with that, we'll turn it back over to Brittany. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your attention and your input.
Thank you so much, Dan and Scott.